house I lived in before this one was beyond haunted, though we never actually physically saw anything. When we first moved in, we were redoing the floor in the kitchen and the master bedroom. My husband at the time would leave for work, and I'd be left alone in this house, with no furniture, no floors, and nothing to do. I can't explain it, but alone in that bedroom at night, I would feel the most mind-numbing fear you could ever think of. I couldn't stay in that room. I bolted out of the house at 4 a.m. after he'd left, and slept in my car with my dog until daylight, and that was just the first experience. A week or so later, the house was finished. We moved all the furniture in, and I began sleeping in my real bedroom across the house. A friend and her husband moved in with us, and the boys went away for training for 2 weeks. They were U.S. Marines, leaving us girls to fend for ourselves. The first night, she comes running into my bedroom asking to sleep with me because her bed was shaking. I laughed it off thinking that she was probably just sleepwalking, but I made room, and no more than 5 minutes later, my bed starts shaking like an earthquake. We stayed completely frozen and waited for it to stop. The next night, same thing. Night after night, our beds would shake and we would be terrified. Her bedroom was the one I had slept in when we first moved in. The room I felt the mind-numbing fear. She refused to sleep in there alone. She said she would hear something, like fingernails in the closet, scratching from the ceiling all the way to the floor. Another night, she went to sleep with her closet door closed and her fan off. She woke up an hour later to her door open and the fan on. Another night, she was in my bathroom, and I was in my bedroom when both lights cut out. We figured, okay, old house, maybe a power outage. So we made our way down the hallway and started flipping switches. Every other light in the house worked, except the 2 rooms that we were in. I called my father, an electrician, asking for help. Everything was working perfectly, yet still, no lights. After 20 minutes of arguing with my father that we were not going back into that room, we finally walked back into my room when both lights magically came back on. We set up a video camera one night around Halloween of last year, hoping to capture something. We positioned it on my kitchen table pointing down the hallway to my bedroom. The first video had shadows crossing the walls when no one else was around, and the picture would become kind of randomly distorted, becoming fuzzy, and then it would become clear again. We fully charged the camera and set it up to run for the next 4 hours. In the video, you can see my ex-husband and I walk down the hall, go into our bedroom, and when we turned off the light, the video stops. The battery was dead after 6 minutes of video, and a full charge. Months later, we were having a bonfire with a bunch of my ex-husband's friends. The boys all came in the house to grab some food and beer. Clark was the first out the door, and came screaming back into the house. Everyone just kind of stared at him like he was crazy and asked what happened. He swore up and down he'd seen 3 men in Civil War uniforms standing around the fire. Clark certainly wasn't drunk, but he was scared out of his mind. Activity slowed down after that, and just little things here and there would happen. Whatever it was got used to us, and turned from scaring us to playing jokes on the new people who came over to spend the night. Their things would go missing, the couch or bed they were sleeping on would shake, but my bed never did again. It almost became a joke around the house. We never did see anything, though. It was 3 a.m., popular Canadian coffee shop. There's one old baker in the back that rarely interacts with me, past a dirty joke, or a dirtier ditty from his Navy days. Other than that, I'm alone. Not another soul around the area, and I expected to remain so for at least an hour yet. I'm boxing up the days old for the homeless shelter when, I swear, I see something out of the corner of my eye. It's behind me. I turn and then look down, and there's a small child standing there. A native little toddler with a faux hawk, staring at me intensely. I'm struck dumb with how absurd the situation is. How did he get behind the counter? I didn't hear the door open, or see him come through the counter. I scan the storefront. No one. I yell for the baker in case he has a friend or something visiting that lost their kid. He comes over, and like me, does a double take at the kid, and is baffled. The kid starts muttering incoherently. I get him a glass of water and a donut hole, and the baker runs out of the store to do a perimeter of the block. I call the non-emergency line and I explain that I have a little kid with no parents. I can't get any information from the boy, just mumbles that I can't make out. The police arrive. Baker comes back and says that he can't find anyone else in the streets. The guy from the 24/7 corner store said he'll keep an eye out, and the police try to speak to the kid and also get nothing but mutterings and half-hearted gestures. They take him away. I see them again for the morning coffee, and they told me that the little guy walked several kilometers from the nearest reservation in the dead of night all the way to my store. He had got into his parents' medicine cabinet and just walked out of the house. I'm floored. It must have taken that poor baby hours to get to me. Seeing him behind me like that in the dead of night still shakes me. It spooked me more than that guy that threw a pot of coffee at me, the woman that tried to stab me with a plastic spoon because, well, I refused to give her a metal one, and the dude that waited around for 4 hours hoping to catch me alone so he could teach me a lesson since I didn't have the flavor of bagel that he wanted. I worked overnight security at a convention center for a few years. One night at like 2 a.m., I was on camera chit-chatting with another officer who was manned at what we called base. I had 2 other guys and my supervisor out on patrol. I saw a homeless dude go up our outdoor elevator to a public terrace and was keeping an eye on him. No big deal. He goes to a corner just out of reach of our cameras, a corner known to us for people to usually catch a quick nap in. I called on the radio to our nearest patrol officer, who was also patrolling with my supervisor, that this guy was hanging out there doing whatever. They casually start walking towards the area. Upon their arrival to the scene, next thing I know, on another camera directly below this terrace, like 50 feet below, also right out of our office, I see a body drop straight down and land on their legs, collapsing to the ground. I quickly stand up from my chair and I'm panicking. I grab the first aid kit and run out of the office to go outside. My other officer on base jumps on the phone and calls 911. My supervisor says, "Base, call 911. We're already on it." I'm the first one there, and this homeless man was writhing in pain, shattered bones protruding from his ankles, bleeding from the mouth, trying to mumble, "What happened?" He manages to roll over and I see his hands are also fucked up, more bones protruding from his wrists. I don't dare touch him, and I doubted my first aid kit would have helped at all. My supervisor and another officer come running down the stairs to the scene. Apparently, when they arrived to the original scene on the terrace, in my camera's blind spot, the guy was sitting on the ledge with the 50-foot drop directly below him. My supervisor yells, "Hey, get down from there!" And the homeless dude just lifts himself up and drops. Not another word spoken. First responders arrive and take him to the hospital. I, of course, had to write the report and review the video of the incident. A cop comes an hour later and shares his condition that he did survive, but will most likely never walk again. No major internal organ damage. Now, for the major coincidence. A few days later, I got a new roommate who brought his girlfriend over. We're all hanging out, talking and drinking. I share that I work security at so-and-so, and the new roommate's girlfriend says, "Oh, didn't you guys just have a homeless man fall off your terrace and almost die?" What the fuck? How did she know that? There was no media coverage. She wasn't there. Apparently, she was the godmother of his children, best friends with the mother. She shares that he was a homeless alcoholic junkie that constantly fought with the police and was in and out of jail multiple times. She got the call that he attempted suicide and rushed with the mother to the hospital to see him. She shared his conditions with me and that he was in critical condition, but was expected to survive. Her and my roommate shortly broke up and I never saw her again. About 10 years ago, I was 20 years old at the time, some of the teenagers from my church decided that they were going to drive down quote-unquote Ghost Road. This is a scenic gravel road in Hardin County, Texas, and it has a history. People who've driven the road have claimed to see a mystery light, but the story that everyone told me, however, is that a little girl would sometimes walk across the road. She would be dressed as a girl from the late 1800s, and those who've seen her say that she walks across the road and stares at you. It takes about 40 minutes to get there from the town we lived in, and on a Saturday night in rural Texas, There's not much else to do for teens except do drugs, have sex, or chase ghosts. They asked me to go with them, but I told them I was too tired and I would go next time. Little did they know my plan was to drive out there solo around 8 p.m. They weren't planning on getting there until 9:30, and then I would hide in the tree line and scare the hell out of them. I arrived. I parked my car on the side of the road a few blocks away from the entrance of Ghost Road, the direction they wouldn't be coming from since my crappy car would have been noticed way too quickly, and I walked about a quarter mile down the dirt road. I brought my multicolor laser pointer because I thought it would be fun to shine that light on the road as cars drove by. I climbed up into a tree, and I waited. I remember how cool it was outside that night. I can still feel the late summer breeze on my skin. The rustling of the trees was both calming and unnerving. I sat in the tree and waited for my prey to arrive, but after about 30 minutes, I started to hear sounds coming from the woods. The sounds were coming from behind me, and they sounded about 50 feet away. Leaves and brush crunching, twigs snapping. I first shook it off as just animals rustling around in the woods, but the sounds continued for another minute or two, and they were headed in my direction. I tried to be quiet, but since I assumed it was an animal, I didn't have any qualms about letting out a cough, and then I heard it, whispering, "Did you hear that? Shh." My heart stopped. Who the fuck was out in the forest? Why are there people wandering in the woods in the dark instead of driving down the road? Though, I suppose I was technically doing that too. I stayed as quiet as possible, and after a few moments of silence, I heard the indistinguishable sound of a shotgun being cocked. Next thing I know, loud shots start ringing out. I hear the shotgun ammo being unloaded as well as what sounded like handgun shots. I also heard some heavy country accents shouting, "We ain't afraid of you goddamn spirits. We know you out here, you motherfuckers. Come on out." I was so scared that I felt like I was gonna black out. I was sweating profusely, and the cool, refreshing summer breeze now turned cold as winter. I had no idea what direction those bullets were flying, and if they would end up coming towards me. After a few more minutes of hillbilly cursing and bullets flying, the sound stopped. A few minutes later, a big Chevy truck drove past, and they were flying down the gravel road, kicking up dust everywhere, which proliferated and got caught in my nose and throat, causing me to cough more. Thankfully, I was almost sure that it was the same guys. After this happened, I decided not to go through with scaring the teens. I just felt lucky to be alive. They could have easily been shooting in my direction. They could have kept walking towards me, and maybe found me. There's no telling what could have happened. I climbed down and made a mad dash back to the car because I didn't want to be seen by these guys if they decided to come back from the other direction. When I got home, I showered and went to bed. Of all the things I hoped to get spooked by on Ghost Road, guns being fired was not one of them. The next day, one of the kids called me and said that I missed out on all of the fun and told me how they stopped at the old cemetery down that road and ran around scaring each other and playing hide and seek. If only they knew. I live on a long island, and there's tons of legends about various places on the island. I think the most notorious, besides the Amityville house, is probably Sweet Hollow Road or Mount Misery, as well as Mary's Grove and Lake Ronkonkoma. They say a bus full of children crashed on Sweet Hollow, and there's also a story about a few boys hanging themselves on the same bridge that the bus crashed into. If you put your car in neutral near the bus crash site, the ghosts of the kids will push your car forward, and if you sprinkle some powder on the trunk of your car, you'll see little handprints from the ghosts. There's another story about a day camp back in the 1930s that was along that road, and children were abused and killed there, and you can see their ghosts along the road sometimes. There's also a ghost cop that was supposedly killed, aka shot in the head, and people say if he pulls you over, you'll see the gunshot wound in the back of his head when he walks back to his car, or he gets his head blown off while walking back to the car. There's also some who say a woman in white walks along the road, and by the way, the road isn't flat, and the slight incline is what causes any movement when you pop your car into neutral. I've been there as I don't live far, and although the road isn't haunted, it's still creepy. A fun drive to have around Halloween for sure. Mary's grave is interesting because nobody actually knows the exact location, or who she was. Some say she was killed by her boyfriend for cheating. Some say she killed him for cheating and the townsfolk killed her for killing him. Some say she hanged herself. Some say she was a witch who was burned at the stake. Some say her mother killed her. Some say she murdered her family and then killed herself. Anyway, they say if you actually find her gravestone, which is said to be behind her home, it won't appear on camera if you take a picture. And they say you can see her hanging body near the said home. If you shut your car off while parked where her home is, it won't start back up. There's rumors of cold spots and voices as well. I think there's something about a candle being lit in the window as well. I've never seeked out her home, nor her grave. And finally, Lake Ronkonkoma. To start, they say it's quote-unquote bottomless. There's talk about the lake having hidden caverns and such. The lake water rises and falls, regardless of the rain or lack of rain. The big story tied to the lake is of a Native American princess that died there in the 1600s. The princess fell in love with an Englishman, but her father wouldn't allow her to be involved with him romantically. The princess ended up killing herself in the lake. I think she rode out and stabbed herself. And each year, her ghost takes the life of a man in search of her soulmate. There have been well over 100 drownings, I believe. Some say more men than women, but others say more women than men. There's no proof the princess ever even existed, though. I've driven by the area, but never really stopped to check it out. Let's call him Joe. When Joe was a kid, he said he and an older relative, maybe an uncle, grandfather, I don't know, I forgot, went into the country to cut wood and loaded into the relative's pickup truck. It was almost dark when they finished, and they began the drive home, down a completely dark and treacherous dirt road through a canyon. The older relative maintained a steady but bumpy 35 miles per hour as they drove. About halfway through this dark canyon, the proverbial shit hit the fan. Joe swore up and down that from the passenger side truck window, from the outside, came a series of short but firm knocks. Joe was caught in a moment of confusion, shock, and fear. He began to turn his head to look out the window when his relative yelled at him to not look and to put his head down. The relative hit the gas. Then, suddenly, there was a dip in the bed of the truck, as if something heavy had jumped in the back with the wood. Then, from the window in the back of the cab, came another series of short, firm knocks. This made the relative hit the gas even more, seriously putting them in danger due to the condition of the road. And the whole time, the relative is loudly chanting a protective prayer in their native language. As they were about to clear the pass, the weight in the back of the truck left or jumped out, whatever, and after a few more minutes, the relative told the terrified Joe that he could look again. As they were about to reach home, the relative told Joe not to mention the incident to other relatives, as it would upset them, and the next day he took Joe to the local shaman to pray over them, so that the evil would forget their faces. Joe concluded the tale by saying, years later, he and the relative talked about the incident again, and he asked the relative what he saw. The relative replied, eyes, red eyes, like the taillights on a car. Joe then asked if that's what he saw, why didn't he slam on the brakes to throw it off? His relative was stone quiet for a moment, and then replied, because there was more than one. My dad has over a dozen stories like this. He grew up in a rural Illinois, near a woodsy area. UFO activity was apparently high back then. I don't know if it was just my family or the whole area, but my dad and grandpa would sit on the porch and watch lights fly around the house. They would do it for fun. This was a long time ago, when my dad was a kid. He's now in his 60s. They would watch the stars dart around like laser lights and laugh about it. Shit is mind-boggling to me now. I've only seen that kind of thing happen once or twice, and it freaked me out. Besides that, a bunch of other weird shit would happen to my dad. Isolated earthquakes in Illinois that nobody else felt. Bright orbs floating around in the sky and following him around, and etc. It's been a while since he's told me these stories, but one of the particularly weird ones has always stuck with me. FYI, I am completely aware that it sounds like my dad was just fucking with me. And trust me, I would prefer to believe that. But I have good reasons to trust him. For starters, he's never lied to me about anything else. He wasn't the type of person to make shit up for show. He also had absolutely nothing to gain from making this shit up. He never tried to publish it or even write it down. He would just talk about it sometimes. Anyway, so my dad was in his teens, and weird UFO shit has been happening his whole life at this point. He's out in his driveway for whatever reason, doing whatever people do when they live in a woodsy rural area. His parents weren't home. They're out shopping or at work or whatever. Suddenly, this big black car pulls up into his driveway. Tinted windows and completely black. My dad just kind of watches it pull in, not sure what to think. There's something to remember here. Not only is this a rural area, but it's approximately 50 years ago. People were a lot more trusting back then. Nowadays, you would be crazy to leave your front door unlocked, but back then, it was no big deal. So this strange black car pulls into my dad's driveway, and it's making no noise at all, which my dad noticed right away. The door opens, and out steps a super tall, fair-faced white man. He has blonde hair, an extremely well-tailored black suit, and black sunglasses on. Right away, my dad could see that there was something off about him. He looks too perfect. Flawless skin, a childlike smile, and very overdressed for a hot summer day. He looks distinctly out of place. The man walks up to my dad and asks for his name. My dad, who was around 15 at the time, asks him why he wants to know. The man smiles and explains that he just wants to ask him a few questions, and that he means no harm. Bemused, my dad agrees, but he's still wary of this strange man. First, the tall white dude asks my dad if he lives here. My dad says yes, and asks why he wants to know. The man has a completely relaxed, non-confrontational tone, and seems almost giddy, like he was really excited to be having this conversation. His childish, overzealous grin hadn't faded in the least. He asks my dad if he had seen, felt, or heard anything that he felt was outside of the ordinary. My dad says sometimes, and again, asks why he wanted to know. The man just kept grinning, and by now my dad was feeling pretty uncomfortable. He had never seen this guy before in his life. He didn't appear to be any kind of government agent. His behavior was far too unusual. Suddenly, the man's demeanor completely changes. His grin disappears and he looks worried. And without so much as a goodbye, he opens his car door, gets inside, and drives away, still making no noise at all. A couple minutes later, my dad's parents come back from shopping. Now for the really weird part. My mom saw the same fucking dude 30 years later. She was in a bookstore looking to buy something. I don't know the details really. When she turned around and noticed this tall, fair-looking blonde guy in a black suit, sitting at a table in the cafe, maybe 30 feet or so from my mom. He was reading a newspaper, and sitting across from him was another dude, dressed exactly the same as the blonde one. They still looked strangely out of place, somehow too perfect, too clean. Now, my mom had heard this story from my dad before, and she actually recognized my dad's description of this man. He definitely stood out. So she's kind of taken aback, trying to figure out if it's actually the man my dad had seen all those years ago. The blonde guy notices my mom looking at him, and again, his demeanor completely changes. He stands up, turns around, and quickly walks out of the bookstore, with a second guy right behind him. What the fuck, right? I'm actually freaking out a bit thinking about this. I'm 22 now, and I have to wonder if I'm going to run into this awkward blonde stalker. It's like the Men in Black sent their most inept agent to follow around my dad. Or the most obvious alien ever is trying to study my family and our natural habitat. I don't fucking know. I know this is all very vague, and I'm going to bring it up to my dad tonight. Maybe try to clarify a few details. I'll be honest, I've pushed this story out of my head because it just weirds me out. Here's my own experience. Be me. Had a pug. Normal doggo. One day he disappears. Lost for a few days. Comes back. Parents and I are happy. But dog starts acting weird. Aggressive as fuck. Brings a dead cat and puts it on my bed. Start making weird noises at night. It sounds like bad attempts to laugh and talk like a person. I'm the only one who notices that. One day, my parents go to Grandma's house. Leaves me alone with the dog. I was sleeping. I didn't even know I was alone. Wake up to someone saying my name. Think it's my dad, 'cause it sounds like a man. Check the kitchen. It's the damn dog, making those creepy noises trying to say my name. run to my room, lock the door, call parents, tell them the dog is talking. They think I'm crazy. Shit gets worse. One day, my dad just starts shooting in the middle of the night. Me and my mom go to look. What the fuck is happening? Dad screams to us to return to our rooms. The dog never comes back. My dad never told me what happened. Months later, Dad gets drunk. He tells me what the fuck happened that night. My dad is stereotypical northern Mexican. Wears boots, hat, and has a rifle. He told me he became suspicious and afraid of the dog after my story. Noticed weird behaviors. One night, hears noises. Thinks it's a thief. Takes rifle, goes to check quietly. Sees the fucking dog, sitting like a person, praying in front of a candle. Dog starts saying something similar to Satan. The fucking dog was praying to Satan. Dad freaks out, starts shooting the dog. Mom and I wake up and check what's happening. Dad screams at us to go back to our rooms. Takes dog's corpse up to a hill and burns it. Years later, and I'm still not allowed to bring any dogs home. I've seen a few weird things in the sky over my life, but that's not when I saw an alien. I was in bed sleeping, and it was like a waking dream. Not sleep paralysis. I could move and get up, and I wasn't scared. Where my bed was at the time, there was a window that shows just outside my back steps and nearby forest. I'm not sure exactly how it started, but at some point, I became aware that some green-furred creature was watching me, peering out from the corner of the bedroom door, on the side by the back door. It was so strange. It's like its skin was green, but its hair was also green. Its eyes were the weirdest part. It had whites around its pupils, but the center of the eyes did not appear to have color, and was just black. Its eyebrows were as hairy, hairless as the rest of its body. The only thing distinguishing them were the seeming muscles of the face of the creature that was staring at me. He was tall, but neither bulky nor slight, but of normal proportion. It had somewhat of a reptilian appearance, but this thing was definitely a mammal. I didn't see any expression of menace or malice, but instead I felt as though whatever that thing was, it was caring for me, like it was looking out for me. And after what felt like maybe 5 minutes, the creature skulked away, and I saw it disappear into the woods. I never felt any threat whatsoever from it. It never spoke a word to me, but I felt information had been exchanged. When I looked upon it and fully embraced what I was seeing, it was like I was overcome with comfort, with calming love. This happened to me years ago, and it's a really, really vivid memory, but everything surrounding it is vague to me. I don't remember exactly how old I was, but knowing where I was at the time, I know it must have been sometime 6 to 8 years ago. Sometimes, I get the sense that there's this big invisible thing hovering over my home, and I've dreamed that there's some wise man in it that's protecting me from something. I saw a vessel that rose straight up from the ground and moved smoothly through the air alongside the car I was in, at a level and sustained altitude until, well, the best way I could describe it, it went quantum speed and zipped off to the horizon. No noise, just a line of the light it gave off, like a zip. 1 second there, the next, it was gone. Absolutely silence, no build-up or charge, just from car speed to fucking near teleportation. I recall it clearly, and it was witnessed by all 3 of my siblings. My dad, the driver, and my mother. This happened in my childhood in the 90s. Pops, bless him, tried to race it, and shrugged off me and my siblings shitting ourselves, because we were scared of being abducted, by saying, well, they will or they won't. He was excited while I was fucking panicking that E.T. would finger my asshole. The vessel looked like the bat symbol, and me and my dad years later, decades really, ran into Bigfoot on the same road. Pops drove up to it and leapt out of his car to try and get a look at it. Bigfoot moves fast, because he got the fuck out of there in the seconds it took the car to speed up, and for my dad to get out of it. I swear, if congenital heart disease doesn't kill him, something supernatural will. Maybe the Mothman. A few years ago, a friend told me an insane experience he had when on Salvia. He said he lived a solid year and a bit as a medieval knight in some fantasy kingdom in his trip, which only lasted 3 hours. He had a bunch of stories of shit that happened in his trip, and explained that time dilated massively, so he felt like each day that passed felt like a normal day, and etc. Inspired by his experience and the resulting tales of him drinking unlimited beer and mead, eating as much boar and beef as he wished, and fucking peasant, orc, and elf bitches, after fighting goblins and trolls, I decided to try salvia as well. However, I had a very different experience. I relaxed, took the salvia, and dozed off to sleep. However, instead of living a medieval fantasy, I woke up and being beaten by a capo in Auschwitz. I don't know why I manifested there. I'm not Jewish at all. I spent 16 months. I made notches on the floor of the cabin I was in for every month I was there, getting beaten, starved, and forcibly worked for long hours, with beatings for minor infractions, and sometimes for no infraction at all. I still had my memories from before the trip, so at first I was comfortable in the knowledge that none of what I was experiencing was actually real per se. However, as the first few days passed, and I didn't wake up in my apartment, I slowly became more nervous as the thought of what I was experiencing was real, and I suffered some sort of mental break or lucid dream that creeped up on me. It didn't matter though, because everything felt real, and that was enough to make the experience hellish. Eventually, after over a year in trip time of this ill treatment, the guards took me and the remaining people from our cabin to get a shower, and instead of water, it was gas, and everyone started screaming and crying and panicking, climbing on top of each other like a writhing pyramid of flesh. But honestly, I couldn't have given a shit at that point. I just let out an audible sigh and closed my eyes. I woke up in my apartment and checked the clock. Turns out, I was tripping for about a day, plus a few hours. I also pissed and shat myself. I'll never take salvia again. What's the worst salvia trip you've ever had? Living a whole new life while tripping is relatively common experience. However, people get wildly different results. Some whimsical and great, and others fucking terrible. Jesus. OP took salvia and fucking entered the Auschwitz hyperbolic time chamber.